In this video, we are going to demonstrate IPv6 router using Kali and PfSense. Download this document under the week 15, and we will see the topology showing like this. The objective of the lab is to review the neighbor discovery that we have been discussing. The neighbor discovery, including the router advertisement, router solicitation, neighbor discovery, and neighbor solicitation, and route redirect. We're going to focus today on the router advertisement and also review or preview the DLC IPv6. We are going to also discuss and explore the security requirements. What do we have to pay attention to before we deploy IPv6 into our network? And we are going to demonstrate if you deploy IPv6 without any RA router advertisement guard, then it can be easily having a fake rogue IPv6 router, either intentionally or unintentionally. Someone may just plug in a router accidentally into your network and started to put out the router advertisement packet and make themselves a default gateway. Okay? And it could cause network interruptions. The net topology looks like this. We are going to fire up the PfSense net, and outside we're going to configure it to 2001. Again, it's the hex number. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to say it's 2001, but it's actually hex. It's not the same number in decimal. Okay, so we use 2001 and a 10 in here, and then use IP0. So outside is the 10 network, just like a 10.10.10 that we've been using. And we're going to fire up a test server here, Windows 2019, and give it an IP address of 2001.10:2. So they are both on 2001:10/64 network, and the IP address here on the 2019 is 2, a default gateway to the 1, and a 1 default gateway to 2. So we don't have to worry about the routing in here. And the inside network is 1. So I use blue color. So in here, we will have 2 workstations. One is the Kali. It's also a DHCP client, and the Windows DHCP also is a client. We use Windows 10, and then we are going to use the Kali to insert the fake router advertisement. Not fake, but the RA with a higher priority to make sure that the Windows 10 will go to the Kali before it goes to the PfSense default gateway. So we are going to log on to the Monsec VMware, and we will see this one. So this is Monsec VMware. Once you log in as a student, you are going to power on the PfSense net and Kali 2 and Windows Server 2019 and Windows 10 as an internal box. In here, because this class, we rarely use the VMware on Monsec. So once you click an image, we don't need this box. I just turn it on to show you that VMware workstation, read it, and if it says take ownership, yes, you're going to take it, okay? And once you take the ownership, right-clicked, and you can start up the guest. And then you're going to say, I moved it. Okay? So it is just a glitch that when the IT duplicating my image for my class. So just bear with that tiny inconvenience. So you're going to go through the whole, the same procedure, like powering on the PfSense net, Kali 2, and Win 2019 and Win 10. Now we are going to go to Windows 2019 once it's powered up, and we're going to sign in. Send the Control Alt and Delete, and you will sign in. And I already signed in there, that's why. And we are going to go into, let me exit it out of here. So once you first sign in, you're going to use the Google Chrome as the document has directed you. Then you are going to go to 10.10.10.53, which is the outside interface of the PfSense to manage it. Admin and password is PfSense 213. The password list is on the first week's document. It will tell you all the username and the password for all the images that I have for this course. Once we get to this point, what we want to do is we are going to go to the interface and go to the WAN and IPv6. So interface, let's go to the WAN first, and we make sure that the IPv6 has been selected, okay? And then we will have to give it an IP address. So the IP address, as you can see, is 10.10.10.53 for the v4. Now we will need an IPv6 address. So it's already been punched in for you to 1001:10. Remember, outside is a 10 network, okay? And then we will have an upstream gateway. That means what is its default gateway on v6. And it's also been put in for you already. Remember, in the topology, 2019 has been given 2001:10:2, right? So we're going to do that. Make sure it default gateway to that one, to the 2019, and 2019 will default gateway back to PfSense, so that we don't have to worry about routing as what we have discussed. So after we've done this, make sure it's a /64, which is pretty straightforward. And we're going to say, yes, we save it and we apply the change. Now we're going to go to the Windows 2019 here and make sure that we have the IP address configured. So you can open the network. And change the adapter options. And you go to the outside. Inside has been disabled, which we don't need it now because it's a 10.10.10.01 network. This Windows 2019 has 2. So right click and look at the property here. And IPv4, as you can see, it's already been 219. Leave it alone because we need that to access the PfSense. The IPv6 is down below here, and let's go change it. Use the static IP address, and it's 2001:10 network, ::2, which is the default gateway of the PfSense. And 64 by default is okay. And as we have discussed, we're going to move it back. And the DNS server, it could be yourself, or it could be 2001:10:1, which is the PfSense. It really doesn't matter what you use. We are not going to use DNS service in here. So once you say okay on that, that's one of the good practice is to ping it. So let's just leave it for now, and let's finish this work. So make sure our WAN already been configured, and then you go to the command prompt, and we can ping actually 2001:10:1. Okay, we can see that it can ping 1 now, and IP config. And you can see that you are 2001:2. And this is self-generated link local address. So and default gateway is correctly set. So that is the preliminary setup steps for that. Now we are going to go back to the document and follow the document to configure the interface of LAN now. We just configure the interface when, right? So we're going to go to the LAN, and we're going to make sure that in here, IPv6 has not been configured. So we have to go static IP. So we go to static IPv6, and now we can leave that alone. And we will need an IPv6 address, which is 2001:1:1, and make sure it's a selection 64 that we choose. Okay. Oops. So /24 for v4, then v6, so that's 64. And as the document mentioned, that this time we don't need to have any upstream gateway, because usually one box has one default gateway, and it should be in the WAN interface instead of in your LAN interface. So at this point, let's save it and apply the change. All right, so make sure that there's no error in there. And after that, we're going to go to the, according to document services, and then we go to the IPv6, the server and router advertisement. Let's click on that. And it can be only enabled on the interface that already have static IP address, which is LAN and WAN. If you open it before, you can only see LAN without, only see WAN, WAN without the LAN, because we just enabled the IPv6 on the LAN, right? So now we're going to make sure that we click on the LAN interface here. And the LAN interface here, we are going to change that. We can enable the LAN. This one, it will, if we do the range like this, we are going to see a number from 1 through 14 for the DHCP server client. And it takes a bit longer to key in, so I changed it. I decided to change that to, click on here, and let's change that to from 2 to 9, because 1 has been used by itself. So we're going to just give them the DHCP address between 2 to 9. So after that, let's take a look at the router advertisement here. And you can see it's managed, and it's normal. We can leave it at normal, or we can change that to low. We can just leave it like this. And let's go back and double check. You see, when we double checked it, we didn't save it, and it seems like it restarted. So you have to be watch out that we have to save it right here. 1, 2. And if you happen to do that, that's all right. You're just going to get the DHCP server address that's a little bit huge for you to key in here. So let's just make sure that we save it. 64-bit, save that. Okay, so once it's been saved, that we can take a look at that. It's okay, nothing to save about, and go back, double check, everything is okay. All right, so now let's continue on to page 4. Then from the window DHCP server client, then we're going to run the Wireshark to try to capture and see if we can see, get a DHCP address on the window 10. So we're going to go to window 10. I clicked and go ahead and send a control delete. Change me. And We go to the command prompt and ipconfig. And you can see we didn't have anything yet. So let's just make sure that we network share center, property, IPv4. We got to enable IPv6 address, right? So we're going to say OK. And we're going to go Wireshark, right? Wireshark is at the end. So we're going to go Wireshark. And this Ethernet. All right, so we're going to wait a little bit for that. You can see that we got the lease already in here. And we can do some filter, such as it's ICMP v6 that we want to see, right? You can just do ICMP v6 and hit enter. So you're going to see ICMP v6. We can actually make it bigger. And we can stop it. I think we already got it. See, we already got the router advertisement. So to save some bandwidth, we can see that. And we can tell, see, you have the source destination, but basically it's neighbor solicitation from the Windows 10 to the 3844, 3844, which is the PfSense inside interface. So let's take a look at the router solicitation from the Windows 10 and soliciting out, and then the router advertisement here. Let's click on the router advertisement. Let's take a look at it, and you can open the ICMP v6 and look at the flags here. Okay, so you need to select the router advertisement. I was selecting the neighbor advertisement. Okay, so router advertisement actually is 134. That's why you see we can even make it more specific. Going here, ICMP v6.type, or you can just go ahead and highlight this guy, right click, and you can say apply as filter, select it. So then it will tell you that. So then you can screen out everything except the router advertisement, which when you take CSS 23 class, we will actually go through Wireshark basics for you to understand the filter. Anyway, so in here you can see the management flag and other flag is already on, but the priority is set to medium, 0 in here. As we saw in the GUI interface of the PfSense configuration from the Windows 2019 Chrome. So that is documented also in your page 4. So continue on with the exercise now. We will, from the Windows DHCP client, which is Windows 10, we actually will got the IP address. So we are going to see and verify the 1360 is its own link local address. Just remember the last four hex number will be good enough. So usually you can go with the link local address as a default gateway. Most likely, if it's DHCP, you will go that way. If you want to add it, you can also add 2001 global address, which we will do for the Kali. So we are going to go to the Windows 10 again. This is Windows 10, so let's reduce that. And then if we do an ipconfig, which we already did, ipconfig in here, and you can see that we have FEA0 in here. So this is 3A 20.44. That's the MAC address of the PfSense, and this is the local address of itself. And we will again at the end of the exercise show you how to show the IPv6 associated with the MAC address of that. So put the MAC address question on the side. Let's take a look at that. To verify the default gateway, actually this FEA0 and the 3A44 belongs to PfSense. You can go to the PfSense and then hit enter a few times, and then we're going to, usually you will see it like this, and then you will go choose number 8 and hit enter, and then you can do ifconfig. So once you do ifconfig, you can see that in here, in EM1, it's actually using FEA0, and you can see that's 3A44, which is the link local address of the inside interface. And that confirms our default gateway here is sending to the link local address of the PfSense. So now let's ping our default gateway. So ping 2001:1:1. It should work. And then we can ping the outside interface of the PfSense. Be aware that if you use ASA, you cannot ping the interface through an interface. But PfSense doesn't seem to care about that. So 2001:1:10, right? Colon 1, which is the PfSense's outside interface, right? So we ping our default gateway, and then we ping the 10, the 1. Now the next one, of course, you will ping the Windows 2019. So we ping that, and it also works. If it doesn't work, if you haven't configured the 2019, in the 2019, if we haven't configured the IP address, then we have to do so. And I actually documented on this particular step. If you wanted to see the configuration of the Windows 19, if at this stage, if it doesn't work, check 3 places. Look at the PfSense firewall inbound rule, which is already pre-configured for you, but you need to configure the Windows outside server to using this 2001:10:2, right? That's what we have been doing in here. Right. So if we want to go to 2019, and you can take a look at your firewall rule. In the firewall rule, there is a rule here, and you can see the IPv6 is already allow anything to come in. That's why that's required in order for you to be able to ping out, and then the return packet will be returned to you. If we wanted to look at what the rules look like, I have a screenshot here and tell you the detail of every single step that you need to configure. It's already pre-configured over there when IPv6 any. So let's take it on the side. If you click on the edit here, then you will see when IPv6 any. And this page may not be so easy to read and understand, but in the document, I did put out the details of what you need to click to understand that. And from the Windows DHCP client, now we're ready to see how it communicates, how it goes through the network. So we're going to look at the topology again. So go back to page 1 to look at topology. We're going to do a trace route from here. So you're going to come in here, and you're going to go through your default gateway 1:1 and go through 10:1 to access 10:2. So from the window box, we're going to do a trace route to 2001:10. Oops. 2. That's the Windows 2019. Okay. So you can see that it goes through 2001:1 is default gateway, and then from the destination, it send it back to you. So it's telling you that it went through 2001:1, and then this interface tells you that, yeah, you reach me. That's the TTL equals 1. That's a trace route detail. So now we are ready to insert using Kali to a road IPv6 router. Okay, so we're going to go to Kali, right-click, and then look at the snapshot and snapshot manager. You currently here, it's actually, if you can see that it's actually on the outside. So we have been using Kali on the outside, but now this time we're going to move it to the inside. So if you click here, you can see it's move from outside to the inside, 10.01.44. So this is what we want. So what we will do is we're going to double click here, and then we're going to say yes to change that to from moving from the inside to the outside, moving from the outside to the inside now. So we're going to say yes. So if you take a look at the snapshot again, you're going to see that now you are in here. You are actually currently having the IP address of moving from the outside to the inside now. So you are from the outside moved from 10.10.10.44 to 10.01. And if you look at the property of the settings of the network, and you can see that it's now in the host only now. It's already been moved from the net into the number 2 automatically. You don't have to change anything. Okay. So once you move it, you just have to choose to move that from the outside to the inside, and then right-click, and there's power on the guest. And then we will log in and make sure that the IP address is 10.0.1.44. So password. It's root ROOT. Change me. All right, so we go into the terminal and do an ifconfig. And you can see that, all right, we have 10.0.1.44 here. And this is some of those old, that image has cached in some of the older IP address. It will work, but we just wanted to make sure that this is not a DHCP address that we have, because we allow it to be from 2 to 9 only. So if you wanted to take a look at that, you can see under services, and then DHCP also has DHCP leases under the status, the leases in here. And you can see that we do have some lease already going on, the 8 and the 9, but not the one with the Kali's FFFF. This is from the previous exercise that I did. I got left inside the image. So we're going to clear up and make sure that it's the updated one. So what we want to do is we wanted to do a show route in here, and it's also documented on your document. But in any case, we're going to clear it up because we're not going to use this cached address, even though it will work. So if you don't want to type, you can go to step number 2. You can see that this is the old cache, the number we want to clear off. You can actually type in those commands to clear it. If you don't like typing, you can right-click and copy here, and then go to the host of the MonSec host, not the VMware, but the MonSec host Then we sign on as a student and open a notepad and copy it in. And from here, you can actually copy one line at a time. So you can take a look at it and we can paste. And this is a notepad in here. Now we need a second line. Actually, you can just up arrow key and then change that to 0. So we kind of disable it and then we enable it for IPv6. And then we're going to restart the manager. It's not too much to type. If you wanted to just enter it, it's under, let's see, uni.d, and if you type in net, it's going to just move it there, and that with a dash. The networking manager, it's easier to use that, and you can do a restart. And then if you do that, you can do another ifconfig to take a look at it. So the address being clear for you, the FFE, the IPv6, the cache one is already, because we disabled it, re-enable it, and restarted the network manager, so it's gone. DH client, IPv6, DHCP, and request one. And you can see that was the V to show you what's the detail, and then do another ifconfig. And now you just requested a new address here. You can see that, okay? Now, one of the important thing is sometimes the gateway is not being implemented in here, so it's not being carried over. So SBIN IP-6, and you can see the route. It's been documented there too. There isn't any route there, so you can actually just go ahead and type it in to add a route. So you can do, I'm just going to type it in, IP route at D4 T VR 2001:1:1, and it's device ETH0. So it's also in the document there. After you do that, you can see that the default route has been added so that we can actually become a router as well. So now we are going to, again, type it in. We're going to type in the Kali, we can also ping. So now we just want to make sure we can ping 2001:10:2, the outside. That has to be ping 6. 10:2. So it should work. So once it's done, again, Control C to break it. If you didn't do a -C space 3, you can do it this way 3 times. Then it will stop at the 3rd ping. Otherwise, it's going to continuously ping. And student asked that before, how to break it. Just hold down Control key and press C a few times. All right, now we are going to copy those 2 things over. We're going to make this one a router. So we are going to go to the notepad here, or you can, of course, type it in, right? Control V. The first one is to make it a router so it can forward. Copy and paste. So it's becoming a router. And the second command is the attack to make it send out the fake router advertisement. So paste that and you hit enter, and we're going to wait, and don't Control C to break it. After you've done that, in your Windows 10 here box, now let's go to it, Windows 10. If you do an ipconfig, and you can see that, okay, now you have 2 default gateway now. The 2AE4 is the fake IP address, the router advertisement from the Linux box. And you can see that they also didn't limit. This is the one you got from your PfSense, and those 2 are from the Kali box. So at this point, if we do a trace route to 2001:10:2, So now you can see that you actually goes to, you are from 1.9, 1:9, and you go to the Kali's 6. And then from Kali, and then it goes to Kali's default gateway of the PfSense, and then go to the target. And you can compare the differences. You can see there is only two routes, directly to the PfSense and go to the destination. And now you go through Kali and go to that. All right. And if we wanted to capture it in here, if we start the capture, you can go here, and we can start it again without saving. And you can see that there's a router advertisement coming in here now. So we can stop it. Let's see, it's from 2AE4, which is, I believe, the Kali. So you can see that it's a high. So it's also been saved as a screenshot for you in there. So that overwrites the medium, the medium router advertisement priority there. So that is the ending of the hands-on exercise that you can see that we got additional addresses and then additional default gateway. You can verify that. The discussion is how do we enable the IPv6 forwarding on Kali, which we just did. That's in the enable the forwarding, and then we also make the PfSense as a default. How to add a PfSense as default gateway on the Kali. So what are the router interface? So you can see that forwarding equals 1. That's the answer for your first question. And how to add a PfSense as a default gateway on the Kali. That is this one, IP route add command here. It's also in the document. And what are the router preferences set in the PfSense and Kali? We have went through that in the, at the beginning of the exercise. And we can also open the window command and run in a NASH and follow the IPv6 interface and do a show neighbor in order to validate what is the IP address here. And for Linux, you will do a IP-6 neighbor show to see that. So we're going to take a look at IP-6. And you can see the show in there. And you can also go to PfSense to show the NDP tables, which is in Windows 2019. Yeah. So under diagnostics, and then you're going to go to NDP table, and you should be able to show that. It's going to take a while. Let's go back to our document where it shows. And this is the table. Eventually, it will show up. If it doesn't, you can disable the firewall to make it run faster on that. And how to mitigate that? We cannot do the mitigation because we are not using the real Cisco switch. We just use emulations, the VMware. So you have to actually enable the RA guard so that you can say, hey, certain ports, you're not supposed to send out RA. And after you did that, then of course, then Kali, once they try to send the router advertisement, it will be shut down here. So that concludes our exercise for this IPv6 security regarding RA guard. So you can see that it eventually shows up on the table to see which one has been leasing out and what's the MAC address. And you can verify that, yeah, the MAC address 3844 in here, matching that of the PfSense inside interface. And then you can see 28E4, which is the Kali's 1.1:6 MAC address, and so on and so forth. So we can validate that. Okay, and that's the end of our video recording.